one gunshot in a city most people couldn't find on a map. That's the story everyone learns. An archduke is assassinated in Sarajevo, and somehow, within weeks, the entire world is at war. It sounds almost absurd when you say it out loud. One bullet triggering a conflict that would kill roughly 17 million people. And that absurdity is exactly why the real explanation matters. Because the assassination didn't cause the First World War. It simply pulled the trigger on a machine that had already been built, piece by piece, for decades. To understand what actually happened on June 28, 1914, you have to go back at least 20 years earlier to a diplomatic strategy that was designed to prevent exactly the kind of catastrophe it eventually caused. By the early 1900s, Europe's major powers had organized themselves into two opposing alliance blocs. On one side, the Triple Alliance, binding Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. On the other, the Triple Entente, an increasingly close partnership between France, Russia, and Great Britain. The theory behind this system, developed largely in the aftermath of earlier conflicts, like the Franco-Prussian War, was that if every major power had powerful allies guaranteed to join any war on their behalf, no nation would risk starting one in the first place. Mutual deterrence, in theory, meant permanent peace. In practice, it meant that once any two nations went to war, their allies were treaty-bound to join, and their allies' allies were bound to join after that. The system built to prevent a small war from happening had, without anyone fully intending it, created the exact machinery required to turn a small war into a global one. Layered on top of this alliance system was something else, an arms race that had been quietly escalating tensions for over a decade before Sarajevo. Beginning in the late 1890s, Germany, under Kaiser Wilhelm II, began an ambitious naval expansion program aimed at challenging British naval supremacy, something Britain had maintained essentially unchallenged for a century. When Britain responded in 1906 by launching HMS Dreadnought, a revolutionary battleship so advanced it rendered every previous warship in the world instantly obsolete, it triggered a frantic building race. Both nations poured staggering sums into constructing Dreadnought-class battleships throughout the 1900s and into the 1910s. This wasn't simply military posturing. It represented a fundamental shift in how Britain viewed Germany, from a rising economic competitor into a direct existential threat to British naval dominance and, by extension, to the security of its global empire. By 1914, the naval rivalry had already poisoned Anglo-German relations for the better part of a decade, long before anyone had heard the name Gavrilo Princip. Meanwhile, in the Balkans, a separate and highly combustible crisis had been building for decades, largely disconnected from the alliance politics of Western Europe, yet destined to collide with them catastrophically. The Ottoman Empire, once a dominant power controlling much of southeastern Europe, had been steadily losing territory throughout the 19th century, and by the early 1900s, its grip on the Balkan region was collapsing entirely. Into that power vacuum stepped fierce nationalist movements, particularly Serbian nationalism, fueled by dreams of unifying Slavic peoples across the region into a single South Slavic state. Austria-Hungary, a multi-ethnic empire that itself contained millions of Slavic subjects, viewed Serbian nationalist ambitions as a direct existential threat, fearing that a successful Greater Serbia could inspire its own Slavic populations to break away. When Austria-Hungary formally annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1908, a region with a large Serbian population, it enraged Serbian nationalists and dramatically escalated tensions between Vienna and Belgrade. 6 full years before the assassination that would finally ignite the wider conflict. This is the context almost never given proper weight in the popular telling. Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, wasn't assassinated in some random, unconnected act of violence. He was killed by a member of a Serbian nationalist secret society called the Black Hand, specifically because of his position as heir to an empire that had annexed territory Serbian nationalists believed belonged to a future greater Serbian state. The assassination on June 28, 1914, in Sarajevo, was not an isolated tragedy that happened to occur at a politically sensitive moment. It was the direct, violent culmination of exactly the ethnic and territorial tensions that had been escalating in the region for years. What happened next reveals something historians consider absolutely crucial, and something the popular narrative almost entirely omits. Austria-Hungary did not respond to the assassination with a reasonable diplomatic protest. Backed by a private guarantee of unconditional support from Germany, historians call this the notorious blank check. Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia on July 23, 1914, containing demands so severe and so deliberately humiliating that Austrian officials themselves reportedly expected, and in some accounts privately hoped, Serbia would reject at least some of them, providing a pretext for war. Serbia, remarkably, agreed to nearly all of the ultimatum's demands, rejecting only a single provision that would have allowed Austrian officials to conduct investigations directly on Serbian soil, a demand that would have effectively violated Serbian sovereignty. Austria-Hungary declared war anyway, on July 28th, exactly 1 month after the assassination. This is where the alliance machinery, built over the preceding decades, took over completely, operating almost independent of individual human decision-making. Russia, positioning itself as the protector of Slavic peoples and Serbia specifically, began mobilizing its military in support of its Serbian ally. And this is the detail modern historians emphasize as one of the single most underappreciated factors in the entire crisis. The physical mechanics of military mobilization in 1914 made de-escalation almost logistically impossible once it began. Mobilizing a European army in this period meant activating enormously complex railway timetables, moving millions of men, horses, and supplies according to schedules planned years in advance, down to the hour. Military planners across Europe had determined that partial mobilization or reversing a mobilization already underway risked catastrophic logistical chaos that could leave a nation defenseless at the exact moment its rivals were fully prepared for war. Once Russia began mobilizing on July 30th, German military leadership insisted that any delay in their own response would hand Russia and France, bound together by their own alliance, a decisive strategic advantage. The trains, quite literally, had already left the station, and stopping them was considered more dangerous than letting the crisis escalate to war. Germany's mobilization plan, meanwhile, was not a flexible or improvised response to the crisis. It had existed, essentially unchanged, since 1905, developed by General Alfred von Schlieffen, specifically to solve Germany's central strategic nightmare, the possibility of fighting a two-front war simultaneously against France to the west and Russia to the east. The Schlieffen plan called for a rapid, overwhelming strike through neutral Belgium to knock France out of the war within roughly 6 weeks, before pivoting the entire German military machine eastward to face the slower mobilizing Russian army. This plan had been refined for nearly a decade before 1914, and once activated, it left German commanders with almost no flexibility to respond differently to the specific circumstances of the Serbian crisis. Germany declared war on Russia on August 1st and on France on August 3rd, immediately invading Belgium to execute the Schlieffen Plan's opening maneuver. This single decision, invading a small, officially neutral nation, whose sovereignty had been internationally guaranteed since 1839, brought Great Britain into the war. Britain had no formal treaty obligation to defend France directly, but it did have a long-standing commitment to protect Belgian neutrality, and more broadly, British leadership had grown convinced over the preceding decade that allowing Germany to dominate the continent, defeating both France and Russia, would fundamentally threaten British security and its global empire. Britain declared war on Germany on August 4, 1914. In the span of just 37 days, a regional assassination in the Balkans had become a continental war involving every major European power, and within months, colonial territories in allied nations across the globe, from Canada to Australia to Japan, were drawn into the conflict as well. Most people believe World War I began because a single act of political violence spiraled unpredictably out of control. It's an understandable interpretation, and one that dominated popular memory for generations. But historians studying the underlying structure of European politics before 1914 argue something quite different. The assassination was less a spark landing on dry, ordinary grass, and more a spark landing directly inside a room that had been slowly, methodically filled with gunpowder for over a decade, through military alliances designed to deter war that instead guaranteed its rapid spread, an arms race that had already poisoned diplomatic trust between major powers, unresolved nationalist tensions in the Balkans following the collapse of Ottoman authority, and rigid military mobilization plans that left almost no room for diplomatic improvisation once the crisis began accelerating. Sarajevo didn't create these forces. It simply gave them their occasion. There's a particularly sobering detail that historians often highlight when studying the July crisis of 1914, the diplomatic scramble between the assassination and the war's outbreak. Many of the political and military leaders making decisions in those final weeks genuinely believed the coming conflict would be short, decisive, and relatively contained, much like previous European wars of the 19th century. Almost none of them anticipated a 4-year industrialized war of attrition that would kill soldiers by the millions across trenches stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border. The system they had built to manage international conflict was calibrated for a very different kind of war than the one modern industrial technology. Machine guns, artillery, and eventually chemical weapons was about to make possible. So why does this matter now in the present day? Because the pattern historians identify in 1914, deep interlocking alliances, an arms race driven by mutual distrust, unresolved regional nationalist tensions, and rigid military planning that removes flexibility during a crisis is not treated by scholars as a uniquely early 20th century phenomenon. It's studied as a case study in how complex, interconnected systems, built with the intention of preventing catastrophe, can instead make catastrophe almost mechanically unavoidable once a single unpredictable event sets them into motion. World War I is remembered as the war nobody wanted, and in a strange sense that may be exactly true. Most of the individual leaders involved in that final July crisis were not seeking a continental war. They were responding rationally to the incentives and constraints of a system that had been built long before them, a system that once triggered no single person seemed able to stop. Perhaps that is the most unsettling truth buried beneath the story of a single assassination in Sarajevo. The war didn't begin because one man fired one shot. It began because an entire continent had spent decades quietly assembling every mechanical piece required for catastrophe, and simply waited without fully realizing it for something, anything, to finally set it in motion.